Welcome back. I'm glad you're here. This video is about what the Chinese were really doing in the Fallout universe before and after the Great War. You think the war in Alaska was the real threat? You think the invasion was what we should have been watching? That was theater, distraction. While America focused on conventional warfare in the frozen north, Chinese agents were already inside American borders, building an infiltration network so deep and so sophisticated that pieces of it are still operating 200 years after the bombs fell. Secret bases under luxury resorts, food processing plants that were really military installations, stealth technology that made American attempts look like children's toys, drone swarms designed to spread paranoia more effectively than bullets, and agents so committed to their mission that even ghoulification couldn't make them abandon their posts. This is the story of what they built, what they planned, and why none of it mattered when the world ended anyway. And if you genuinely enjoy this kind of dark storytelling, consider subscribing and liking the channel, but only if it truly resonates with you. I need to tell you something before it's too late. Before the Wasteland swallows what's left of the truth, you think you know what the Chinese were doing before the bombs fell. You think it was just the war in Alaska, the invasion that everyone talks about. But that was the noise, the distraction. What they were really doing, what they accomplished right here on American soil, that's what keeps me awake at night. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I found in the archives, deep in a bunker that should have stayed sealed. What matters is understanding that when the world ended, the Chinese were already inside. They had been inside for years. Let me start with something simple. Mama Dolce's. You've seen the abandoned food processing plants scattered across the wasteland, rusted conveyor belts, broken windows, the kind of place raiders use as a temporary camp before moving on. But Mama Dolce's was never really about food. I stood in the ruins of the one in Morgantown, West Virginia. The smell of decay was so thick you could taste it, mixing with the metallic tang of irradiated water seeping through the foundation. On the surface, it looked like any other pre-war factory that got caught in the blast. But underneath, hidden beneath layers of concrete and steel, was something else entirely. The People's Liberation Army didn't just send soldiers to fight in Alaska. They sent ghosts. That's what the Americans called them. Hei Gui, black ghosts. These weren't regular infantry. These were operatives trained in infiltration, espionage, stealth technology so advanced that it made American attempts look like children playing with toys. The Chinese stealth suits, the real ones, could bend light around a person. Not like the crude stealth boys the Americans reverse engineered. Those things were unstable, flickering, unreliable. The Hei Gui suits were perfect. Near-perfect invisibility, a modulating field that transmitted reflected light from one side of an object to the other. You could be standing 3 feet from someone wearing one and never know they were there. I found records of their deployment. Elite units called Crimson Dragoons wearing these suits in Alaska, slipping through American lines like smoke, but Alaska was theater. The real operation was happening in places like Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Point Lookout. Anywhere the Chinese could establish a foothold. Mama Dolce's was a cover operation. The 127th Division of the PLA used it as a staging ground. On paper, it was owned by a dummy corporation. The workers had American names: Robert Whiteman, the plant manager; Thomas Jenkins, Michael Smith, Jonathan Apple, Joe Jones, all fake. All Chinese agents with forged documents so good that even federal investigators couldn't tell the difference. They produced real food. They had to. The revenue stream needed to be legitimate, independent from the mainland. But underneath the factory floor, they were doing something else. Building weapons, training operatives, preparing for the invasion that everyone knew was coming but nobody could stop. The Liberator robots. You've probably stepped over their rusted shells without thinking twice. Those little artillery-shaped drones that look almost comical now. But before the war, they were psychological warfare made metal. The Americans laughed at them at first, called them jokes. Weak firepower, easy to destroy, a waste of ammunition. But that was the point. The Chinese understood something fundamental about warfare. It's not always about killing efficiently. Sometimes it's about being everywhere, watching everything, spreading paranoia like a virus. The Liberators were deployed by air, dropped across American territory in the days leading up to the Great War. They had weak lasers that barely burned skin. They had speakers that broadcast propaganda in broken English and Mandarin, but they also had recording equipment. They were surveillance drones disguised as combat units. Imagine being an American soldier, walking patrol through your own neighborhood, and seeing one of those blue shells perched on a fence post. its red star glowing in the dark, speaking in a language you don't understand. You shoot it, it dies, but 10 more appear the next day, and the next, and the one after that. They were mass-produced, cheap, expendable. For every one destroyed, 3 more took its place. And all the while they were recording, transmitting data back to bases like the one underneath Mama Dolce's, building maps of American infrastructure, identifying weak points, gathering intelligence on troop movements, supply lines, civilian morale. The facility in Morgantown wasn't just producing them, it was improving them. I found terminal entries describing the Mark series, Mark 0 through Mark 5, each iteration better than the last. Improved weapons systems, better deployment capabilities. The Mark 5 could actually kill instead of just maim. By the time the bombs fell, they had perfected the design. But here's what really gets to me. The automated factory at Fujian Intelligence Base. It had launch bays disguised as smokestacks. They could produce and deploy these machines without anyone noticing. Just plumes of smoke from a factory. Nothing unusual in industrial America, except those weren't exhaust fumes. Those were drone deployment systems, sending hundreds of liberators into the surrounding countryside every single day. The Americans eventually figured it out. Not all of it, but enough. The Department of Intelligence learned in 2075 that Chinese stealth capabilities were so advanced they could be conducting large-scale operations without leaving evidence. They were right, but by then it was too late to do anything about it. The facility I'm telling you about, the one under Whitespring Resort in West Virginia, the Americans didn't even know it existed. Not the government, not the military, nobody. It was called the Deep. Whitespring itself was a luxury resort, the kind of place where senators and politicians went to relax, to make deals away from the cameras. Underneath it, the Enclave built a massive bunker, state-of-the-art automated systems, enough supplies to last years, designed to preserve the continuity of government in case of nuclear war. The Chinese knew about it. Of course they knew. They had operatives everywhere. And while the Enclave was building their bunker, the Chinese were building their own facility right next to it. A massive cave system stretching beneath the hills, with a base in the center surrounded by the same toxic liquid you find near fissure sites now. Their mission was simple: get a motherlode drill operational, tunnel into the Enclave bunker, capture the secrets inside, gain access to American command infrastructure, military protocols, launch codes, everything they needed to win the war without firing another shot. They were so close. I found the motherlode acquisition facility. The drill was almost ready. Another few months, maybe less, and they would have breached the bunker walls. But the bombs fell first. What do you think really happened here? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd like to know if I'm the only one who feels this way. The Chinese agents in the Deep survived. Ghoulification kept them alive while the radiation killed everything else. 200 years later, some of them are still there, still trying to complete their mission, still operating the drill, still attempting to break through. The same thing happened at Mama Dolce's in the capital Wasteland. The remnants of the 127th Division, now ghoulified, still defending the facility in 2277. They still invoke Chairman Cheng's name when they fight. They still hate Americans with the same burning intensity they had before the bombs fell. They don't know the war is over. Or maybe they know and don't care. Maybe when you've been stranded in enemy territory for 2 centuries, abandoned by your own government, the mission becomes the only thing keeping you sane, the only thing that gives meaning to an existence that should have ended long ago. I met one of them once, not face to face, but I listened to a holotape recording from an agent named Mochou. She was part of the Crimson Dragoons, elite stealth operatives. She and another spy, her lover, realized something during their time in America. They realized that the People's Republic didn't care about its own people. They were expendable, tools to be used and discarded. So they deserted, tried to disappear into the wasteland, start over, but you can't escape your past out here. Mochou was eventually recaptured and sent to the Turtle Dove detention camp in Maryland. When the bombs fell, she was still there, locked in a cell, waiting for an execution that never came because everyone who could have carried it out was already dead. Years later, she survived as a ghoul. Her daughter joined a group of survivors at Foundation. Mochou tried to warn them, tried to tell them that the old loyalists were still out there, still enforcing discipline, still executing deserters according to pre-war protocols. Even 25 years after the Great War, Chinese political officers were active in Appalachia, forcing other survivors to stay loyal to a government that no longer existed. The enforcement was brutal. I read the reports from the Deep. Any agent caught with unauthorized items could be executed. If you didn't have your identification visible at all times, summary execution. The rules were so strict, so unforgiving, that it made you wonder what kind of nation creates a system that values obedience over survival. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the other locations. The network was bigger than anyone realized. Point Lookout, Maryland, a coastal area with fog so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. The Chinese had a submarine station there, SSN 37-1A. It was still functional when I found the records, beached off the coast but intact enough to tell its story. The sub's mission was surveillance, watch the Naval Recruiting Center, observe military officials at Turtle Dove Detention Camp, gather intelligence on American coastal defenses. Standard espionage work, except this was happening on American soil, in American waters, and nobody knew it was there until after the world ended. 2 agents were posted in Point Lookout, one Yang and another operative whose name was scrubbed from the records. Yang had multiple aliases: Jamie Patrick, Maria Lopez, Stanley Derrick, Five-Claw Dragon. She was so deep undercover that even when the Americans caught her during the Niagara sabotage investigation in 2062, they couldn't unravel all her identities. She carried self-destruct codes in a dental capsule. Think about that for a moment. A hollow tooth filled with encrypted information that could destroy a nuclear submarine. If you were captured, if you were tortured, if you broke under interrogation, you could bite down and release the codes, or you could swallow it and let it kill you slowly. Either way, the mission stayed secure. Yang was eventually caught and transferred to Turtle Dove. The Americans knew she was important, but couldn't figure out exactly what she knew. She died there, in a cell, before the bombs fell. Her skeleton is probably still there, mixed with all the others who never made it out. But she wasn't alone. There was an entire intelligence bunker in the Point Lookout area, hidden, fortified, stocked with enough supplies to last years. The Chinese planned for everything. They knew the war would escalate. They knew nuclear weapons would eventually be deployed. They prepared for a scenario where their operatives would need to survive and continue operations, independently for extended periods. The Taft Tunnel, under the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. When I explored the archives about that place, I found something that made my blood run cold. Chinese weapons scattered everywhere. Radio equipment, listening devices, evidence of a listening post positioned directly beneath one of the most important American landmarks. The Pentagon was right there, literally above them. American command structure, military planning, communications infrastructure, all of it flowing through systems that the Chinese were monitoring in real time. How long had they been there? How much had they learned? The records don't say, but the implications are staggering. I found a reference to a mobile headquarters, an 18-wheeler truck converted into a command center for infiltration operations. It could move between locations, coordinate multiple cells, maintain communications with the mainland. The Americans never found it. As far as I can tell, it's still out there somewhere, buried under rubble or hidden in a warehouse that nobody's bothered to search yet. There were safe houses scattered across the region. Broadcast Tower KT-8 had a Chinese bunker. An abandoned apartment building in the pit housed another safe house. These weren't temporary camps. These were permanent installations with supplies, weapons, encrypted communication systems. The kind of infrastructure you build when you're planning to stay. And then there's Alaska. Everyone knows about Alaska. The invasion in 2066, General Jing Wei leading Chinese forces to seize American oil reserves. That was the official war. The one that got reported. The one that American soldiers died fighting. But even there, the stealth operations were more important than the conventional warfare. The Crimson Dragoons operated behind American lines, gathering intelligence, sabotaging supply routes, assassinating officers. The Americans captured some of their Hei Gui suits and tried desperately to reverse engineer the technology. RobCo Industries worked on it for years. They understood the basic principle, the light modulation field, but they couldn't replicate the stability. The stealth boys they produced were inferior in every way. Short battery life, unstable field generation. The user would flicker in and out of visibility, creating a disorienting effect that was almost worse than being fully visible. The Chinese suits didn't have these problems. An operator wearing a Hei Gui suit could maintain invisibility for hours, moving through enemy territory without detection. Some models even had integrated night vision systems, giving the wearer a massive tactical advantage in any lighting condition. I found design documents at the X-13 research facility in Big MT. The Americans had captured several suits and were studying them obsessively. The notes are desperate, frantic. Engineers trying to understand technology that was decades ahead of anything America had developed. They failed. By the time the bombs fell, the Stealth Boy project was still producing unreliable units that worked sometimes but failed when you needed them most. The Chinese stealth technology was so advanced that American intelligence estimated in 2075 that there was a 91% chance China had conducted large-scale experimentation with capabilities the Americans couldn't even imagine. Ghost fleets, stealth submarines that could operate completely undetected, ships that could sail into American harbors, deploy operatives, and leave without anyone knowing they'd been there. Station A31 and B19 reported sightings of vessels that appeared and disappeared from radar, ships that showed up on sonar for a moment and then vanished completely. The reports were dismissed as equipment malfunctions or operator error, but they weren't wrong. The Chinese had achieved something the Americans thought was impossible. There was a report from the Shanxi province. No actionable intelligence for over 3 years, but suddenly massive imports of complex polymers and synthetic compounds. The quantities were consistent with stealth technology research on a macro scale. Not individual suits, not small-scale testing, industrial production. The American analysts didn't want to believe it. One officer's notes end with, "Until you can give me something concrete, I don't want to hear another goddamned word about this." Classic bureaucratic denial, refusing to accept intelligence that contradicts your worldview until it's too late to do anything about it. Camp Liberty in Shenandoah National Park. This one's particularly twisted. The American government became so paranoid about Chinese infiltration that they tried to replicate Chinese brainwashing techniques. They wanted to prove that the Chinese were using psychological warfare on American youth, radicalizing them, turning them into communist sympathizers. So they set up Operation Sleeping Giant. They took Boy Scouts, children, and subjected them to experimental brainwashing protocols. The program worked too well. The Scouts were successfully radicalized, embraced communist ideology, and after the bombs fell, they formed a hostile commune that attacked anyone who approached. Think about what that means. The Americans were so afraid of Chinese psychological operations that they performed those same operations on their own children to prove it could be done, and in doing so, they created exactly what they feared. A group of American citizens loyal to communist ideology, surviving in the wasteland, carrying on the Chinese mission without ever having been contacted by actual Chinese agents. The irony would be funny if it wasn't so horrifying. But let me tell you about the Hoover Dam operation. This one almost succeeded. This one came within minutes of changing everything. Hoover Dam had a secret genetics laboratory, classified sublevel 1C. The Americans were conducting research that could have turned the tide of the war. Biological weapons, genetic modifications, things that would make the forced evolutionary virus look tame by comparison. The Chinese knew about it. Their intelligence network was that good. Shortly before the Great War started, they sent an infiltration and sabotage team to destroy it. Chinese stealth soldiers wearing early-generation Hei Gui suits, the ones that didn't have full invisibility, but were still effective enough to get past perimeter security. Some of the team made it into sub-level 1C. Others went to the main generator rooms, the scum pits, to plant bombs. The plan was simple: destroy the dam, destroy the laboratory, ensure the genetic research could never be used against China. One of the bombs detonated prematurely. The entire facility went on alert. Guards flooded into sub-level 1C. There was a firefight. The Chinese soldiers were trapped, cut off from their extraction point, surrounded by American security forces. They fought to the last man. When the Americans finally cleared the laboratory, they found bodies in Chinese stealth armor scattered throughout the complex. The genetics research was saved. The dam remained intact, but it was close. If that bomb hadn't gone off early, if the timing had been just slightly different, one of America's most critical infrastructure points would have been destroyed before the war even reached its final phase. The bodies remained there for 200 years. When NCR forces finally explored the sublevels, they found the suits in a storage room, mixed in with radioactive waste. 2 intact Hei Gui suits, early generation models covered in dust and dried blood. Some NCR soldier probably looked at them and thought they were just pre-war relics, curiosities from a dead world. They had no idea they were looking at evidence of how close the Chinese came to winning before the bombs fell. If you've ever wondered what choice you would make in a situation like this, tell me in the comments. I'll be reading them. The Chinese operations weren't just about military targets. They understood something fundamental about America. The real power wasn't in the government buildings or the military bases. It was in the infrastructure, the supply chains, the systems that kept society functioning, LOB enterprises, Happy Liberty imports, more dummy corporations, more fronts for Chinese operations. They weren't attacking America with bombs and bullets. They were infiltrating the systems that made America work, positioning themselves to collapse everything from the inside when the moment came. The agents received equipment through these corporate fronts. Weapons, radio gear, propaganda materials, technical supplies. Everything they needed was shipped in through legitimate business channels. Customs inspectors would check the manifests, see nothing unusual, wave the shipments through. Meanwhile, encrypted intelligence reports were hidden in hollowed-out merchandise, weapon components disguised as industrial parts, communication devices built into everyday electronics. The revenue streams were real. That was the genius of it. These weren't just shell companies on paper. They generated actual profits, paid taxes, employed American citizens who had no idea what they were really part of. The cover was so deep that even when American intelligence started investigating, they couldn't find concrete evidence of wrongdoing. I spent weeks going through financial records from LOB enterprises. Import-export business, perfectly legitimate on the surface. But buried in the accounting, if you knew what to look for, you could see the patterns. Shipments that weighed slightly more than their declared contents. Orders placed in quantities that didn't match retail demand. Payments routed through multiple subsidiaries before reaching their final destination. The Zhurong V418 Chinese pistol. LOB Enterprises manufactured it, an incendiary variant of the standard Type 17, designed to set targets on fire. The Americans who bought it thought they were getting exotic foreign weaponry, something unique to show off at the range. They never knew they were funding Chinese intelligence operations with every purchase. The food at Mama Dolce's was adulterated with lumber mill byproducts, not because the Chinese were trying to poison Americans, though I'm sure some thought that. It was economics. After strong initial growth, the operation needed alternative revenue sources. Cutting corners on food quality increased profit margins, which funded more important activities underground. Nobody questioned it. Pre-war America was full of corporations cutting corners, adulterating products, prioritizing profit over safety. One more company doing it just blended into the background noise of capitalist decay. The perfect camouflage for a military intelligence operation. Agent Huang commanded the Mama Dolce's cell in the capital Wasteland. His terminal entries are chilling in their bureaucratic normalcy. Job and wage are secured for each within-cover operation. Required to inform when first stage of operation is completed. Hail the People's Republic, first stage. That phrase kept appearing in the documents. First stage of what? The records don't specify, but the implication is clear. Whatever the Chinese were planning, it had multiple phases. Infiltration was just the beginning. Establishment of infrastructure, building a network, and then something else. Something that never got to happen because the bombs fell first. But here's what really keeps me up at night. The Americans never fully uncovered the network. Even after the Great War, even after 2 centuries of wasteland scavengers picking through every ruin, there are still Chinese installations that haven't been found. How many more bases like the Deep are out there? How many bunkers are still sealed, still powered, still waiting? How many ghoulified Chinese soldiers are maintaining their posts in facilities we haven't discovered yet? The Fujian intelligence base in Morgantown. The Enclave eventually found it and eliminated the holdouts. Agent Gray's report is matter of fact. We've established control of the facility, removing what appear to be the last holdouts of a Chinese research team. We attempted capture, but they resisted and had to be put down. World's a better place with a few less Reds anyway. But Gray's report also mentions something interesting. They found the Liberator bot system documentation and considered it the most promising technology for Enclave use. After eliminating the Chinese researchers, the Enclave took their work and repurposed it. President Thomas Eckhart, paranoid and obsessed with continuing the war against communism, deliberately unleashed the Liberators on Appalachia. He wanted to trick the DEFCON system into raising the alert status so he could launch nuclear missiles from the automated silos. He needed an invasion, so he manufactured one using Chinese technology. The machines that were designed to prepare for a Chinese invasion ended up being deployed by an American madman trying to start another nuclear exchange. The irony is almost too perfect. The Chinese created weapons of psychological warfare and an American used them to terrorize his own people. By 2102, the liberators were still functioning across Appalachia, still broadcasting propaganda, still attacking non-Chinese units according to their original programming. Autonomous war machines continuing a conflict that ended over a century ago because nobody ever told them to stop. I watched one once, from a safe distance. It was perched on a rusted car, its red star flickering in the fading light. The speakers crackled to life. Mandarin phrases heavily distorted. "We must not stop. Revolution is a must." Over and over, like a prayer or a curse. Then it detected me. The eye swiveled, locked on. The laser charged with a high-pitched whine. I ran, and it followed, flying through the air with its blades extended. I made it to cover, but I could hear it outside for hours, circling, searching, waiting. That's what the Chinese understood about warfare. You don't need to kill everyone. You just need to make them afraid. Make them spend ammunition on targets that don't matter. Make them waste resources hunting ghosts. Wear them down psychologically until they make mistakes. The liberators were never supposed to win battles. They were supposed to make Americans paranoid, exhausted, desperate. And they worked. By the time the Great War started, American soldiers were shooting at shadows, wasting supplies on threat assessment protocols, losing sleep over machines that posed minimal physical danger, but maximum psychological impact. And here's the truly disturbing part. The Chinese agents who survived the Great War, the ones who ghoulified and kept going, they adapted to the Wasteland better than almost anyone. They had training, discipline, purpose. While other survivors were scrambling just to find food and water, the Chinese remnants were maintaining operational security, defending their installations, continuing to gather intelligence even though there was nobody left to report to. Captain Zao and the Yangtze 31 submarine. I found it in Boston Harbor in 2287, still functional despite massive damage. Zao was the only crew member who retained his sanity. The rest had gone feral, trapped below decks, attacking anything that moved. Zao knew the war was over. He understood that China was gone, America was gone, everything was gone. But he stayed at his post anyway, maintaining the submarine, trying to repair the radiation leaks, attempting to complete a mission that no longer had any meaning. I talked to him, asked him why he stayed. He said something that I'll never forget. "What else is there? Without duty, without purpose, I am just a monster waiting to go feral like the rest." That's what the war did to people. It broke them so completely that even when the world ended, they couldn't stop. The mission became their identity. Without it, they were nothing. The Shi in San Francisco, descendants of the crew from the Chinese submarine Shi Huangti. After the Great War, they salvaged the submarine's supercomputer, called it the Emperor, and built an entire society around it. They turned San Francisco into a center of scientific research, one of the most advanced communities in the Wasteland. They weren't agents, they weren't spies, they were just sailors who survived and adapted. But their success proved something important. The Chinese weren't just good at infiltration and sabotage. They were good at survival, their training, their discipline, their ability to work together toward a common goal. It gave them advantages that other survivors didn't have. The American response to Chinese infiltration was brutal and indiscriminate. Chinese Americans were rounded up and sent to concentration camps. People who had lived in the United States for generations, who had never set foot in China, who were as American as anyone, they were imprisoned based on nothing but ancestry. The paranoia was so severe that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The government treated all Chinese people as potential enemies, which pushed some of them toward actually becoming enemies. Why be loyal to a nation that sees you as a threat no matter what you do? I found records of internment camps scattered across the country, families separated, property seized, people disappearing into government facilities and never coming out. The same thing that happened with Japanese Americans during World War II, but worse, because this time the threat was real and the war was existential. And the truly sick part is that it didn't work. All the internment, all the paranoia, all the persecution, it didn't stop the Chinese intelligence network, because the real spies weren't Chinese Americans. They were PLA operatives with perfect false identities, agents who looked nothing like what Americans expected, networks so deep and so professional that racial profiling was useless against them. The Americans wasted resources persecuting their own citizens, while the actual Chinese agents operated freely. Robert Whiteman at Mama Dolce's wasn't detained. Thomas Jenkins wasn't investigated. Michael Smith wasn't flagged as suspicious. Because their papers were perfect, their cover stories were airtight, and they didn't fit the profile that paranoid Americans were searching for. That's another thing the Chinese understood about America. Racism could be weaponized. American assumptions about what Chinese people looked like, how they spoke, how they behaved. Those assumptions created blind spots. Agents who didn't match the stereotype could operate with relative impunity, while the government terrorized innocent families. If this story has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these dark confessions from the Wasteland, hit that subscribe button. It tells me someone out there is still paying attention to warnings like these. The biological weapons research. That's something most people don't know about. The Americans accused the Chinese of developing bioweapons, and they were right. But America was doing the same thing. Both sides were racing to create diseases, viruses, genetic modifications that could wipe out enemy populations while leaving their own people intact. China used aggressive biological weapons during the Sino-American War. The records mention this but don't provide details. What kind of weapons? How were they deployed? What were the effects? The information is classified or lost. But the American response suggests it was devastating enough to justify emergency countermeasures. The forced evolutionary virus. People think that was Vault-Tec, or the military, or some rogue scientists. But what if it wasn't? What if it was originally a Chinese bioweapon that the Americans captured and tried to reverse engineer? The FEV creates super mutants, massive creatures with incredible strength but reduced intelligence. That's not what you'd design if you wanted an effective weapon. But it might be what you'd get if you tried to weaponize captured research you didn't fully understand. I can't prove this. The evidence is circumstantial at best, but the timeline fits. The Americans were desperate to counter Chinese biological capabilities. They had captured Hei Gui suits and were studying them. Why wouldn't they also have captured biological samples? And why wouldn't they try to turn those samples into weapons of their own? The research facilities at Big MT were obsessed with Chinese technology. Every captured piece of equipment was dismantled, analyzed, replicated. The stealth suits, the weapons, even the propaganda broadcasts were studied for psychological warfare techniques. The Americans were so focused on matching Chinese capabilities that they lost sight of developing their own innovations. That's what happens in an arms race. You become reactive instead of proactive. You spend all your resources trying to catch up to your enemy instead of finding new approaches they haven't considered. By 2077, American research and development had become almost entirely focused on countering Chinese advantages rather than creating their own. The annexation of Canada proves this. America needed Canadian resources to fuel the war effort, so they forced passage rights for military forces, then used a pipeline sabotage as justification for full annexation. It wasn't strategy, it was desperation. The Chinese were winning the resource war, and America was scrambling to secure enough fuel to keep fighting. The Chinese invasion of Alaska was calculated. They knew American oil reserves were limited. They knew that cutting off Alaskan oil would cripple American military operations. It was a strategic move designed to win through attrition rather than direct confrontation. Classic Chinese military philosophy: attack the supply lines, weaken the infrastructure, let the enemy collapse under their own weight. The deployment of T-45 power armor stopped the Chinese advance, but barely. The situation devolved into trench warfare with neither side able to break the stalemate. Both nations were bleeding resources into a frozen wasteland, throwing lives away for oil fields that were already running dry. The liberation of Anchorage in January 2077 was celebrated as a great American victory. General Constantine Chase winterized T-51 power armor, breaking the Chinese lines. It was propaganda. Good propaganda. Effective propaganda. But propaganda nonetheless. Because by then, the war was already lost for both sides. The peace talks collapsed on October 23, 2077. That morning, at Anchorage, negotiators from both sides tried one last time to find a solution. It failed. Hours later, the nuclear missiles launched. Who fired first? The official American position is that China launched first. Chinese submarines were detected off the California coast at 03 EST. High-altitude bombers appeared over the Bering Strait at 0337 EST. The first missile launches were detected at 0913 ST, but I've read enough classified documents to know that official positions are often lies. The Americans launched a retaliatory strike, yes. But what if the Chinese were retaliating too? What if someone else fired first? Some third party or rogue commander or automated system that nobody could control? The truth is buried under nuclear fire and 2 centuries of decay. Maybe nobody knows who started it. Maybe it doesn't matter. The result was the same either way. By 0947 EST, most American facilities were offline. The Great War lasted less than 2 hours from first detection to final impact. 2 hours to end the world. Everything humanity had built, all the cities and nations and cultures and histories, reduced to ash and radiation in the time it takes to watch a movie. The Chinese agents on American soil were caught off guard, even at Fujian intelligence base, where invasion plans had already been prepared. The announcement that nuclear weapons were being launched was never sent. They had no warning, no evacuation orders, no final instructions. They were abandoned, left to die in enemy territory while their homeland burned. Some of them must have realized it immediately. Others probably held out hope that rescue would come, that the motherland would send extraction teams, that their sacrifice meant something. The rescue never came. China was gone. The People's Republic ceased to exist in nuclear fire, just like America ceased to exist, just like the Soviet Union and Europe and everywhere else that had the misfortune of having nuclear weapons pointed at it. And still, the agents maintained their posts, the ones in Mama Dolce's, the ones in the deep, the ones scattered across America in safe houses and bunkers and hidden installations. They kept going because that's what their training demanded, because admitting the mission was over meant admitting they were stranded, alone, abandoned in a dead world with no purpose and no hope. The ghoulification saved some of them. Radiation that would have killed normal humans instead transformed them, gave them immortality at the cost of their humanity. They watched their skin rot and peel. They felt their bodies decay while their minds remained trapped inside. Some went feral, losing all sense of self, becoming mindless creatures driven only by hunger and rage. But others retained their consciousness. Agent Mochou, Captain Zao, the soldiers at Mama Dolce's, the communists in the deep, they stayed sane, or something close to sane, even as centuries passed and the world they knew disappeared completely. What does that do to a person? Living for 200 years in a body that's falling apart, in a world that's moved on, serving a government that doesn't exist, following orders that no longer have any meaning. How do you maintain discipline and purpose when everything you fought for is dust? I think that's why they became so rigid, so unforgiving. The Chinese remnants in the deep executed their own people for minor infractions. Unauthorized items meant death. Missing identification meant death. Anything that threatened operational security, any deviation from protocol, it all ended the same way. Not because they were cruel. Because without the rules, without the structure, without the mission, they had nothing. The discipline was the only thing keeping them from descending into the same chaos that consumed the rest of the wasteland. So they enforced it absolutely, mercilessly, because the alternative was accepting that they were already lost. The Enclave tried to continue the war. Thomas Eckhart, sitting in his bunker under Whitespring, convinced himself that other Enclave facilities had been destroyed and that he was the last hope for America. He murdered his own people, anyone who opposed his plans, and declared himself president of a nation that no longer existed. He wanted to launch more nuclear weapons, wanted to finish what the Great War started. To do that, he needed to raise the DEFCON level, which required a credible threat. So he activated the Liberators, unleashed Chinese robots on Appalachia, manufactured an invasion to trick the automated defense systems. It didn't work. Modus, the AI running the bunker, eventually turned on Eckhart and killed him, but not before he'd murdered dozens of Enclave members and terrorized the few survivors trying to rebuild in the region. The war made him insane, or maybe he was already insane, and the war just gave him permission to act on it. That's what the conflict did to people. Americans and Chinese, soldiers and civilians, everyone touched by it. The paranoia, the hatred, the certainty that the other side was evil incarnate, it poisoned minds and destroyed souls. By the end, there were no good guys, just different brands of monsters fighting over the corpse of a dead world. The Chinese stealth technology that seemed so advanced before the war. In the Wasteland, it's just another relic. The suits break down, the power cells die, the modulating fields fail. I've seen scavengers wearing Hei Gui armor with the stealth systems completely non-functional, using 200-year-old Chinese military equipment as nothing more than regular protective gear. All that research, all that innovation, all the spies who died to protect those secrets, and it ends up as Wasteland armor with a busted cloaking device. The cutting edge becomes the obsolete, the priceless becomes the worthless. Time makes fools of us all. The Liberators are still running, but they're glitchy now. The programming degrades. They attack everything or they attack nothing. They broadcast propaganda, but the speakers are so distorted you can't understand the words. They're less psychological weapons and more environmental hazards, like rad scorpions or feral ghouls. Just another thing in the wasteland that wants to kill you. I found one that had been reprogrammed, made into a pet by some settler who didn't understand what it was. They'd painted over the red star, given it a name, taught it to follow simple commands. The irony was almost beautiful. A weapon designed to spread communist ideology across America, reduced to a mechanical companion for someone who probably couldn't even spell communism. The bases are being discovered, one by one. Vault dwellers explore the deep and find the motherlode facility. Wastelanders stumble into Mama Dolce's and fight the ghoulified remnants. Each discovery reveals another piece of the network, another fragment of the infrastructure that China built on American soil. And with each discovery comes the same realization. They almost won. If the bombs had fallen 6 months later, if the motherlode drill had breached the Whitespring bunker, if the invasion plans at Fujian had been executed, China might have been in position to seize control of American territory before the nuclear exchange made it all meaningless. The infiltration was nearly complete. The infrastructure was in place. The agents were positioned. All they needed was the order to activate, to move from passive observation to active sabotage, to transition from the first stage to whatever came next. But the order never came. The bombs fell first, and 200 years later, the Chinese agents are still waiting, still defending installations that don't matter, still maintaining equipment that has no purpose, still following a mission that ended before it began. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if China had won, if their stealth operations had succeeded, if they'd captured American leadership, if they'd seized control before anyone could launch the missiles. Would the world be better? Would Chinese rule have been more benevolent than American hegemony? Probably not. Power corrupts regardless of ideology. The Chinese government sent agents on suicide missions and abandoned them without hesitation. They subjected their own people to brutal discipline and summary execution. They would have ruled America the same way they ruled China, with an iron fist and zero tolerance for dissent. Different tyrants, same tyranny. The war was never about freedom or democracy or communism or capitalism. It was about which empire got to control the last remaining resources on a dying planet. Both sides were willing to destroy the world rather than let the other side have it. And in the end, that's exactly what they did. The agents in the field knew this, I think. The ones who deserted, like Mochou and her lover. The ones who questioned orders and wondered what they were really fighting for. They saw through the propaganda and recognized the truth. They were pawns in a game played by men who would never face the consequences of their decisions. But recognizing the truth didn't save them. Mochou was captured. Her lover probably died in the initial blasts. The deserters were hunted down by loyalists who couldn't accept that the mission was a lie. And everyone, loyalist and deserter alike, ended up trapped in the same irradiated hellscape, wondering what it had all been for. The answer, of course, is nothing. It was all for nothing. Every spy who froze to death in an Alaskan trench, every operative who maintained cover in America for years, living a false life, unable to contact family or friends, or anyone from their real identity. Every scientist who worked in secret facilities developing weapons that would never be deployed. Every soldier who died believing their sacrifice mattered. All of it. For nothing. The oil they fought over, burned up or buried under radioactive waste. The territory they tried to control, transformed into a toxic wasteland where nothing grows and everything kills you. The governments they served, obliterated in nuclear fire, leaving behind only ghosts and echoes, and the occasional automated system, still following orders from dead leaders. I've walked through the ruins of Chinese installations across the wasteland, the deep, with its toxic pools and desperate ghoul defenders, the listening post in Taft Tunnel, full of equipment that will never transmit another signal, the submarine off Point Lookout, beached and broken, a coffin for men who died believing they were protecting something worth protecting. Each site tells the same story. Preparation without payoff, infrastructure without purpose, weapons that fired too late or not at all, a massive intelligence network that gathered information nobody would ever use, because everyone who might have cared was already dead. The holotapes are the worst. I've listened to dozens of them. Chinese agents recording their observations, filing reports, maintaining protocol even as the world crumbled around them. You can hear it in their voices, the professionalism gradually giving way to uncertainty. The routine phrases becoming desperate mantras, the slow realization that nobody is listening on the other end. One recording from Fujian, dated October 24, 2077. An agent speaking in Mandarin, voice steady despite what must have been sheer terror. The facility has sustained heavy damage. Surface conditions are unsurvivable. We are sealed inside, awaiting extraction orders. Long live the People's Republic. There were no extraction orders. The People's Republic was gone. They died in that facility. Or they survived as ghouls and were eventually killed by the Enclave. Either way, their final transmission went unanswered because there was nobody left to answer it. Another holotape from the deep. This one dated 2098, 21 years after the bombs. A communist commissar addressing the surviving soldiers. Discipline must be maintained. The mission continues. Any deviation from protocol will be met with extreme prejudice. We are the last defenders of the revolution. We will not fail. 21 years of maintaining protocol in an underground facility, surrounded by toxic waste, slowly rotting from radiation exposure, enforcing rules for a government that existed only in their memories. That's not dedication. That's madness wearing the mask of duty. But I understand it. I've spent enough time in the Wasteland to know how easy it is to lose yourself. When everything you knew is gone, when everyone you cared about is dead, when the world has become something alien and hostile, you cling to whatever gives you structure. For the Chinese remnants, that structure was the mission. Without it, they were just monsters in a cave. With it, they were soldiers serving a purpose. It's the same for everyone out here. The Brotherhood of Steel clings to their technology hoarding mission. The Enclave remnants cling to their vision of American restoration. The NCR clings to their attempt at rebuilding democracy. Everyone needs to believe they're working towards something meaningful, because accepting that it's all meaningless is too painful. The Chinese agents just had the misfortune of clinging to a mission that was obsolete before it even started. I found Agent Mochou eventually. After everything I'd learned, I had to meet her. She was at Foundation with the settlers, living with her daughter Jen. She'd given up the Chinese stealth suit, destroyed it so the old loyalists couldn't track her anymore. She was trying to build something new, something that wasn't defined by the war. I asked her what it was like, serving the People's Liberation Army, spending years undercover in America, watching the bombs fall and knowing everyone she'd left behind in China was dead. She looked at me with those ghoul eyes, filmed over and distant. "You want to know what I learned?" she said. "I learned that nations are lies. China lied. America lied. They both promised they were fighting for their people, protecting their citizens, building a better future. But when it mattered, when the moment of truth came, they chose to destroy everything rather than compromise. That's what nations do. They kill their children and call it patriotism." I asked if she regretted joining the PLA, if she wished she'd made different choices. "Every day," she said. "But regret doesn't change anything. The past is fixed. All we can do is try not to repeat the same mistakes in whatever future we manage to build." She was right, of course. But knowing she's right doesn't make it easier. Because everywhere I look in the Wasteland, I see people repeating the same mistakes. Different names, different flags, same tribalism and paranoia and certainty that their side is righteous and the other side is evil. The Chinese understood psychological warfare better than anyone. They knew how to manipulate fear, how to spread paranoia, how to make enemies waste resources fighting shadows. The liberators weren't just propaganda machines. They were mirrors, reflecting back America's own anxiety and militarism and obsessive need for security. And America fell for it. Spent billions on defense systems, rounded up innocent people, militarized society until there was no distinction between civilian and military life. The Chinese didn't need to defeat America militarily. They just needed to trick America into defeating itself. Except it didn't matter, because China fell into the same trap. They militarized just as aggressively. They sacrificed their people just as readily. They became just as paranoid and authoritarian as the enemy they opposed, two mirrors reflecting each other into infinity, each becoming what they hated most about the other. The stealth suits, the liberators, the secret bases, all of it was impressive from a technical standpoint. The Chinese demonstrated innovation and strategic thinking that was genuinely remarkable. But to what end? The most advanced infiltration network in human history, and it accomplished exactly nothing except ensuring that Chinese agents were present when the world ended. If I could send a message back through time, if I could warn the Chinese agents before they accepted their assignments, what would I say? I'd tell them the truth. That they're going to spend years or decades living false lives in enemy territory. That they're going to watch their homeland burn from thousands of miles away. That they're going to survive the apocalypse only to spend centuries as rotting ghouls, defending facilities that have no strategic value, following orders from leaders who are already dead. I'd tell them that everything they're about to sacrifice will be wasted, that the mission will fail not because they failed, but because success was impossible from the start, that the war they're preparing to fight will end with everyone losing and no one winning. Would they believe me? Probably not. When you're young and idealistic, and your government tells you that you're serving a greater purpose, you want to believe it. You need to believe it. The alternative is accepting that you're just a tool being used by people who don't care whether you live or die. The Chinese agents were brave. I won't take that away from them. Living undercover in hostile territory takes courage. Maintaining discipline for decades takes dedication. Surviving ghoulification and remaining sane takes strength I can't even imagine. But bravery in service of a pointless cause is tragedy, not heroism. The Wasteland is full of these tragedies. Every faction, every settlement, every individual survivor is carrying the weight of something that was destroyed before they were born, or when they were too young to understand it. We're all living in the aftermath of decisions made by dead people for reasons that no longer exist. The Chinese installations will eventually be cleared out. The ghoul remnants will be killed, or will finally go feral and lose the last fragments of who they were. The technology will be scavenged and repurposed. The history will be forgotten or distorted beyond recognition. In another 200 years, maybe nobody will remember that China and America fought a war. The names will be meaningless sounds. The ideology will be incomprehensible ancient philosophy. The causes will be lost to time. All that will remain is radiation and ruins, and the vague understanding that the old world destroyed itself. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe forgetting is the only way forward. Maybe the next civilization, if there is one, needs to start fresh without the burden of knowing exactly how stupid and stubborn and self-destructive humanity can be. But I can't forget. I've seen too much, learned too much. I know what the Chinese were doing and why it didn't matter. I know about the network of spies and the infiltration operations and the stealth technology and the psychological warfare. I know how close they came to achieving objectives that would have been meaningless even if they'd succeeded. And I know that somewhere out there are still Chinese agents maintaining their posts, still following protocols, still believing that the mission matters because accepting that it doesn't would mean accepting that their entire existence has been pointless. Maybe one day, the last Chinese remnant will finally die or go feral. The last Liberator will run out of power. The last secret base will be discovered and cleared. And that will be the end of it. The final chapter in a war that ended 2 centuries ago but refuses to fully die. Until then, they're still out there. In bunkers and caves and submarine wrecks, ghoulified soldiers wearing tattered uniforms, carrying rusted weapons, speaking languages that most Wastelanders can't understand. Living monuments to the futility of war. If you see one, don't make the mistake of thinking they're harmless relics. They're still dangerous, still trained, still capable. 200 years of surviving in the Wasteland has made them tough in ways that power armor can't replicate. But more than that, they're warnings, physical reminders of what happens when nations choose ideology over survival, when governments treat people as expendable resources, when the need to win becomes more important than understanding what winning actually means. The Chinese were playing the long game. Deep infiltration, patient observation, building infrastructure for operations that would unfold over years or decades. They were thinking strategically in ways that America, with its impulsive military responses and short-term political cycles, couldn't match. And it didn't matter, because while both sides were playing their complicated games, positioning their pieces, preparing their strategies, the board caught fire and burned everything to ash. That's the lesson. That's what I learned from studying Chinese operations in the Fallout universe. It doesn't matter how clever you are. It doesn't matter how well you plan. It doesn't matter how dedicated your agents are or how advanced your technology is. If your ultimate goal is winning a war that can only end in mutual annihilation, you've already lost before you begin. The Chinese knew this, I think. Some of them anyway. The deserters like Mochou who realized the whole thing was insane and tried to walk away. They were the smart ones. They understood that survival was more important than victory. But they were the minority. Most of the agents stayed loyal, kept following orders, kept believing that what they were doing mattered. And when the bombs fell, that loyalty didn't save them. It just meant they died, or ghoulified, while still convinced they were serving a righteous cause. This is my confession, my warning, my testimony. The Chinese weren't the villains of the Fallout universe. Neither were the Americans. They were both victims of the same sickness, the same nationalist fervor, the same inability to back down even when backing down was the only rational choice. The real enemy was the mindset that made the war inevitable. The belief that some things are worth destroying the world for. The certainty that your side is right and the other side is evil. The inability to see that from the enemy's perspective. You're the enemy. I'm telling you this because the Wasteland is starting to rebuild. Factions are forming. People are choosing sides. And I can already see the same patterns emerging. The same us versus them mentality. The same willingness to sacrifice everything for abstract ideals. We have a chance to do better. To learn from the past instead of repeating it. But that only works if people actually understand what happened and why it was wrong. The Chinese operations in America were sophisticated and impressive and ultimately meaningless. Just like the American operations in China. Just like everything both sides did to prepare for a war they should have been trying to prevent. Don't make their mistake. Don't let ideology override survival. Don't convince yourself that some abstract principle is worth more than the lives of real people.